The courtroom smelled like old money and older secrets. Ida Hunt stood at the towering mahogany doors, her fingers tight around the handle of her briefcase. The leather was warm from her grip, almost too warm, and she forced herself to loosen her hold before her palms started sweating through her gloves. Hello, my lovely family, and welcome to Velvet Underworld. Before we begin, let me say this: you matter, and your presence here is never ordinary. If you're watching right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Don't forget to like this video and turn on your notifications, because the stories here are meant to be felt, not just heard. Let's begin. Behind those doors sat 200 people who'd paid obscene amounts for a seat at this trial. Journalists, socialites, business rivals who'd flown in from 3 continents just to watch a king bleed. And her husband. The bailiff gave her a curt nod. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and pushed through. The whispers started immediately. That's her. I heard she's been living in the guest house for 6 months. Poor thing. He's going to destroy her on that stand. Ida didn't look at any of them. Her heels clicked against Italian marble as she walked down the center aisle, each step measured, deliberate. The burgundy suit she'd chosen that morning had been a calculation. Bold enough to command attention, professional enough to be taken seriously. She'd thrown away the softer colors he'd always preferred. The pastels and creams he said made her look sweet. Approachable. Harmless. The courtroom was a cathedral to power. Vaulted ceilings that stretched 30 feet high, carved from limestone that had witnessed 100 years of verdicts. Brass fixtures gleamed under carefully positioned lights, and the judge's bench loomed like a throne at the front of the room. The American flag stood sentinel in the corner, stars and stripes rendered almost black in the dramatic shadows. And there, at the defendant's table, sat Waldo Walsh. He was laughing, not a polite chuckle or a nervous twitter. A genuine, shoulders-shaking laugh that echoed through the cavernous space and turned every head in the room. His attorney, a sharp-faced man named Corrigan who charged $1,500 an hour, was whispering urgently in his ear, but Waldo waved him off like he was swatting a particularly bothersome fly. Ida's stomach turned to ice. She'd known he would do this. Known he'd find some way to humiliate her even here, even now, with federal prosecutors breathing down his neck and the FBI's evidence boxes stacked against the far wall like a promise of ruin. But knowing didn't make it easier to watch. Waldo Walsh didn't just sit in a chair, he owned it. His navy suit was custom Brioni, probably $30,000 of Italian wool and hand-stitched perfection. The cut emphasized his broad shoulders, the kind of build that came from a personal trainer, a private gym, and the arrogance of a man who'd never been told no. His dark hair was swept back from a face that belonged on magazine covers, all sharp angles and dangerous charm. A 5 o'clock shadow dusted his jaw, calculated to look just disheveled enough to seem human. His wedding ring caught the light as he draped one arm over the back of his chair. The same ring she'd slipped onto his finger 4 years ago, when she'd still believed in things like forever. His eyes found hers across the courtroom, and his smile widened. It wasn't the smile he'd given her on their honeymoon in Santorini, when he'd kissed her on a terrace overlooking the sea. It wasn't the smile from their engagement party, when he'd whispered that she was the only real thing in his entire manufactured life. This smile was a predator recognizing prey. Ida didn't flinch, didn't look away. She held his gaze as she walked past the gallery, past the prosecution's table where 3 stone-faced attorneys sat surrounded by evidence that could put him away for 20 years. She held his gaze until she reached the witness section and finally, mercifully, sat down. Only then did she let herself breathe. All rise. The judge entered. A severe woman in her 60s named Castellanos, who had a reputation for eviscerating defense attorneys and a zero-tolerance policy for theatrics. Her robes whispered against the steps as she climbed to the bench, and when she sat, the entire room followed. Except Waldo. He took his time, stretching slightly, adjusting his cufflinks, making sure everyone noticed that he was choosing to sit, not being commanded. When he finally settled back into his chair, he caught Ida's eye again and winked. Her nails dug into her palms. "Mr. Walsh," Judge Castellanos said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I trust you understand the gravity of the charges against you." "Completely, Your Honor." His voice was smooth, cultured, touched with just enough humility to sound respectful without actually being humble. "Though I have absolute faith that these misunderstandings will be cleared up shortly." Misunderstandings. 47 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy. Shell companies in the Caymans. Real estate deals structured through offshore accounts that the FBI had been tracking for 3 years. Connections to the Volkov family, a Russian organized crime syndicate that controlled half the luxury construction in the Northeast. Misunderstandings. The lead prosecutor stood, a man named Graves with iron gray hair and the reputation of a pit bull. "Your Honor, the government is prepared to present overwhelming evidence of the defendant's criminal enterprise. We have financial records, witness testimony, and documented proof of Mr. Walsh's systematic corruption of—" Yes. Waldo's attorney, Corrigan, rose smoothly. "And the defense is prepared to demonstrate that Mr. Walsh is a legitimate businessman who's being targeted because of his success and his association with certain individuals who may have complicated histories." Translation: because he was married to Ida Hunt, whose father was a federal judge and whose uncle sat on the Senate Finance Committee. Waldo had married into political royalty, and everyone in this courtroom knew it. He'd also destroyed that connection systematically, methodically, with the patience of a man who understood that power was something you took, not something you earned. Judge Castellanos reviewed something on her desk. "Before we proceed with opening statements, I understand there's a witness matter to address?" Ida's heart stopped. "Yes, Your Honor." Corrigan's voice was silk over steel. "The defense would like to call Mrs. Ida Walsh to." "Hunt," Ida said. Every eye in the courtroom turned to her. She stood slowly, aware of the weight of 200 stairs, aware of the cameras that had been banned from inside, but were probably perched on every rooftop outside. Most of all, she was aware of Waldo's gaze, suddenly sharp, suddenly focused in a way that made her skin prickle. "My name," she said clearly, "is Ida Hunt. Not Walsh." Judge Castellanos's eyebrow rose a fraction. "Noted. Ms. Hunt, you're prepared to testify today?" This was it. The moment when she could still turn back. Still walk out of this courtroom, file for divorce quietly, take the settlement Waldo's lawyers had offered. $10 million and a non-disclosure agreement that would ensure her silence for the rest of her life. She could disappear, change her name again, move to California or Europe or somewhere so far from this disaster that she could pretend these 4 years had never happened. She could let him win. Ida looked at Waldo. Really looked at him. At the man who'd courted her with Shakespearean intensity, who'd learned her favorite flowers and the exact way she took her coffee. The man who'd promised her partnership and given her a gilded cage. Who'd isolated her from her friends, her family, her career, so slowly and carefully that she hadn't noticed until she was completely alone. The man who'd built an empire on blood money and lies, and smiled while doing it. His expression had changed. The amusement was still there, but something else lurked underneath. Curiosity, maybe. Or the first flicker of something that might have been concern. "Good. Yes, Your Honor," Ida said, her voice steady. "I'm prepared." She heard Waldo's low chuckle from across the room, saw him lean toward Corrigan and murmur something that made his attorney's face go carefully blank. He thought this was a show. Thought she was going to get on that stand and either perjure herself to protect him or fall apart under cross-examination. He'd probably bet Corrigan $100,000 on how quickly she'd crack. Judge Castellanos made a note. "Very well. We'll hear from Ms. Hunt after opening statements. Counsel, you may begin." As Graves launched into the prosecution's opening, detailing the architecture of Waldo's criminal enterprise with devastating precision, Ida watched her husband. He was watching the prosecutor, but his body language screamed boredom. One hand played with a fountain pen, Mont Blanc, because of course it was. His jaw was relaxed. His breathing steady. He wasn't worried. Not about the 47 counts. Not about the FBI's evidence. Not about the witnesses who'd already turned on him or the paper trail that led directly to his door. He wasn't worried because he was Waldo Walsh, and men like Waldo Walsh didn't lose. Except Ida knew something he didn't. She knew exactly how powerful men fell. And she knew that sometimes the person who destroyed you was the one who'd loved you most. When Graves finished his opening statement, a masterwork of prosecutorial fury that left half the courtroom pale, Judge Castellanos turned to the defense. Corrigan stood, buttoned his jacket, and delivered a rebuttal that was equal parts charm and misdirection. He painted Waldo as a self-made success story, a man who'd built his fortune through intelligence and hard work, who was now being persecuted by a government that didn't understand sophisticated international finance. The jury looked uncertain. Good. Uncertainty meant they could still be swayed. Ms. Hunt, Judge Castellanos said when Corrigan finally sat down. Please approach the witness stand. Ida stood, smoothed her jacket, picked up her briefcase. That's when Waldo's expression finally changed. His eyes dropped to the briefcase, the same one she'd carried into the courtroom, the same one she'd been clutching like a lifeline. She saw the exact moment he registered that something was wrong. Saw his body language shift from relaxed to alert, saw him lean forward just slightly. She walked past the prosecution's table, past Corrigan, who gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She walked past Waldo. As she did, she heard his voice, low and intimate, pitched just loud enough for her to hear. Don't do this, sweetheart. For years of marriage in 3 words. The pet name he'd always used. The threat wrapped in velvet. Ida didn't stop walking. She reached the witness stand, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then she sat down, placed her briefcase on her lap, and looked directly at Waldo Walsh. His face was unreadable now, professional mask firmly in place. But his knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the table. Judge Castellanos looked at Corrigan. Your witness, counselor. Corrigan stood, every movement calculated to project confidence. Ms. Hunt, thank you for being here today. I know this must be difficult, testifying about your husband. I'm not testifying about my husband, Ida said. The courtroom went silent. Corrigan's smile faltered. I'm sorry. Ida looked at Judge Castellanos. Your Honor, there's been a misunderstanding. She opened her briefcase, pulled out a leather folio embossed with the seal of the United States Department of Justice. I'm not here as a witness. She stood, and her voice rang through the courtroom like a bell. My name is Ida Hunt, and I'm the lead prosecutor on this case. The laughter still echoed in Ida Hunt's ears as she crossed the threshold of courtroom 7B. It wasn't the polite chuckle of a nervous defendant. It was the full-bodied, condescending laugh of a man who believed himself untouchable. Waldo Walsh's amusement had rippled through the gallery like a shockwave, turning heads, raising eyebrows, making the court stenographer's fingers pause above her keys. He thought this was theater. Entertainment. He thought she was the punchline. Ida's heels clicked against the marble floor with metronomic precision, each step a countdown he didn't know was ticking. The burgundy suit she'd chosen that morning wasn't an accident. It was armor. It was war paint. The kind of power color that said she belonged in rooms where decisions were made and futures were destroyed. The courtroom was a cathedral of old money and older justice. Vaulted ceilings. Dark wood panels that had witnessed a century of verdicts. Afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting geometric shadows across the floor. The American flag hung motionless in the corner, a silent witness to what was about to unfold. Waldo sat at the defendant's table like a king holding court in enemy territory. His navy suit was custom-tailored, probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the light as he leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the back. His wedding ring glinted. The same ring she'd accepted 4 years ago when she'd believed in forevers and fairy tales. His attorney, Grayson Locke, sat rigid beside him. Locke was known for getting wealthy men out of impossible situations. He specialized in making evidence disappear and witnesses reconsider their testimonies. His silver hair, and expensive cologne couldn't hide the predator underneath. But neither of them was looking at Locke right now. The gallery behind them was packed. Journalists, rival business moguls, socialites who'd come to watch Waldo Walsh's empire crumble or survive. They whispered behind manicured hands, their eyes following Ida's progression down the aisle. Poor thing, their expressions said. Coming to testify against her own husband. Or maybe to save him. Either way, she's in over her head. Waldo's dark eyes tracked her movement with lazy amusement. She could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, sliding over her like he still had the right. Like she was still his to assess, to own, to dismiss. The smirk on his face said everything. You're out of your depth, darling. You always were. Judge Ramona Castellano sat elevated behind the bench, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been appointed to federal court 20 years ago and had a reputation for being utterly immune to charm, money, or intimidation. Mrs. Hunt, the judge said, her voice carrying through the sudden silence. Please approach. Ida didn't hesitate. She walked past the bar that separated the gallery from the well of the court. Behind her, she heard Waldo whisper something to Locke. Another chuckle. The sound of a man who thought he'd already won. 18 months, Ida thought. 18 months of letting him believe I was weak. 18 months of being underestimated. She could still remember the moment she'd realized the truth. 2 years into their marriage, late at night, when she'd woken up to use the bathroom and heard him on the phone in his study. The door had been cracked open, and his voice had been different. Colder. Talking about shipments and cleaning the accounts and making sure Kozlov's people understand the terms. She'd stood frozen in the hallway in her silk nightgown, listening to her husband discuss things that sounded like they belonged in crime dramas, not in the life of a legitimate real estate developer. The next morning, he'd kissed her forehead at breakfast and asked if she wanted to go shopping. Like she was a doll, a pretty thing to dress up and parade around. That's when she'd made the decision. Mrs. Hunt, Judge Castellano continued, looking down at her notes. You're listed as a witness for the prosecution. Is that correct? The courtroom held its breath. Ida felt the weight of 300 eyes on her back. She felt Waldo's stare burning into her spine. She could imagine his expression, tolerant, maybe even a little proud that his wife was brave enough to come support him. Or perhaps worried that she'd been coerced into saying something damaging, something his lawyers could easily discredit. He still thought he knew her, thought he understood the limits of her courage. Ida reached the prosecutor's table and placed her leather briefcase on its surface with a controlled thud. She turned to face the judge, her posture perfect, her chin lifted. This was it. The moment 18 months of sacrifice culminated. The late nights he'd thought were charity galas, but were actually meetings with FBI Special Agent Victoria Chin. The book club, that was really strategy sessions with federal prosecutors. The lunches with old college friends, who were actually forensic accountants walking her through shell corporations and money laundering schemes. Every lie had been necessary. Every deception had been survival. Your Honor, Ida said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the courtroom. I'm not here as a witness. Behind her, she heard Waldo shift in his chair. The leather creaked. Judge Castellano's eyebrows rose slightly. I'm sorry. Ida reached into her briefcase and withdrew her credentials. The leather case flipped open to reveal the official identification that had been issued to her 3 months ago, after she'd passed the bar examination for the second time. This time in New York, where Waldo's crimes had been committed. My name is Ida Hunt Walsh, she said, her words landing like hammer blows. I'm an attorney licensed to practice in the state of New York. And as of 6 weeks ago, I've been appointed special prosecutor for this case by the district attorney's office, working in coordination with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the courtroom exploded. Journalists lunged for their phones. The gallery erupted in gasps and urgent whispers. Someone dropped a pen, and it clattered across the floor like gunfire. But Ida didn't turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on Judge Castellano, waiting for the confirmation she already knew was coming. Your Honor, Grayson Locke was on his feet, his voice sharp with disbelief. "This is highly irregular. The prosecution can't simply." "The prosecution can appoint any qualified attorney they choose, Mr. Locke," Judge Castellano interrupted, her tone suggesting she was enjoying this more than her neutral expression revealed. "If Ms. Hunt has passed the bar and been officially appointed, she has every right to prosecute this case." The judge's eyes moved to Ida. "I assume you have the documentation?" "All filed with the court clerk this morning, Your Honor." Ida's voice didn't waver. "Along with my disclosure of potential conflicts of interest, which have been reviewed and approved by the Ethics Committee." She could feel it now. The exact moment. The invisible cord that had bound her to Waldo for 4 years. The cord of assumption, of underestimation, of control, snapping cleanly in two. Finally, she allowed herself to turn. Waldo Walsh was no longer laughing. His face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. Those dark eyes that had tracked her with such dismissive amusement now stared at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not in 4 years of marriage. Not in the year they'd dated before that. Shock. Pure, unfiltered shock. His mouth had gone slack. His hand, which had been so casually draped over the chair, now gripped the armrest with white-knuckled intensity. His wedding ring caught the light again, but now it looked different. Less like a symbol of ownership and more like a shackle he hadn't realized he'd been wearing. Grayson Locke was whispering urgently in his ear, but Waldo wasn't listening. He couldn't look away from her. Ida met his stare with calm, controlled power. This was the woman he'd never bothered to know. The Harvard law graduate who'd finished in the top 10% of her class before he'd convinced her to take a break from her career. The strategist who'd spent 18 months building a case that would dismantle everything he'd built on lies and blood money. The woman who'd loved him once, desperately, and who he'd destroyed so thoroughly that she'd had no choice but to destroy him in return. "Ms. Hunt," Judge Castellano said, and there might have been the faintest note of approval in her voice. "You may proceed with your opening statement." Ida turned back to the judge, but not before she caught it. The flicker of something dangerous in Waldo's eyes. Not just shock anymore. Something darker. Something that looked almost like hunger. He was seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her. And God helped them both, but part of her felt the old pull. The magnetic attraction that had drawn them together 5 years ago. The chemistry that had made her ignore every red flag, every warning sign. But chemistry didn't matter in a courtroom. Only evidence did. "Thank you, Your Honor." Ida opened her briefcase and withdrew the first exhibit. A photograph of an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The beginning of the paper trail that would bury him. Her hand was steady as she approached the evidence display. Her voice was clear as she began to speak. But underneath the armor, underneath the power suit and the prosecutor's authority, her heart was pounding. Because she knew what came next. Weeks of trial. Weeks of facing him across this courtroom. Weeks of dismantling the empire they'd built together, even if she hadn't known what foundation it rested on. Weeks of pretending that some treacherous part of her didn't still remember what it felt like to be loved by Waldo Walsh. Before she'd learned that his love was just another form of possession. Another asset to acquire and control. "The prosecution will demonstrate," Ida said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "that the defendant, Waldo Walsh, has systematically engaged in money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit fraud over the past 7 years. We will show that his real estate empire is nothing more than an elaborate front for criminal enterprise. And we will prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he is guilty of every single charge brought against him." She turned then, letting her gaze sweep across the defendant's table. Across Locke's barely concealed fury. Across Waldo's stunned, hungry, desperate expression. "The evidence will speak for itself," Ida finished. "And unlike my husband, evidence doesn't lie." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Or a declaration of war. Waldo Walsh's fingers curled into fists on the table. His jaw clenched. And in his eyes, Ida saw the exact moment he realized the truth. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd controlled and dismissed and underestimated for 4 years, was about to be his destruction. And there wasn't a damn thing his money or power could do to stop her. The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence as Ida Hunt rose from the prosecutor's table, her burgundy suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the mahogany paneling. Every eye in the gallery tracked her movement, reporters leaning forward with hungry anticipation, spectators whispering behind manicured hands, federal agents standing stoic along the walls. But Ida felt only one gaze burning into her skin with the intensity of a brand. Waldo Walsh sat at the defendant's table like a king temporarily inconvenienced by peasant proceedings. His charcoal Brioni suit probably cost more than most people's cars. The Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the light as he drummed his fingers against the table's edge, a calculated display of boredom that didn't quite reach his eyes. Those storm-gray eyes that had once looked at her with something she'd mistaken for love. Now they watched her with something far more dangerous. "Your Honor," Ida's voice cut through the tension, steady and cold as winter steel. "The prosecution would like to present our opening evidence. What the court is about to see represents 3 years of meticulous investigation into the defendant's criminal enterprise. An empire built on blood money, corruption, and the systematic destruction of anyone who stood in his way." She clicked the remote in her hand. The massive screen behind her flickered to life, displaying a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and property acquisitions that spanned 3 continents. The numbers were staggering. $47 million, 62 properties, 18 known associates with ties to organized crime families. Walsh Development Corporation, Ida continued, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached the jury box, appears on paper to be a legitimate luxury real estate firm. The defendant has been featured in Forbes, Architectural Digest, and the Wall Street Journal as a visionary developer transforming urban landscapes. She paused, letting the weight of that reputation settle before she destroyed it. The truth is considerably less glamorous. Walsh Development is a sophisticated money laundering operation that processes illegal funds through luxury property acquisitions, then resells them at inflated prices to create the appearance of legitimate profit. The defendant has funneled over $47 million in illegal proceeds through his developments in the past 5 years alone. Waldo's fingers stopped drumming. Ida didn't look at him, but she felt the shift in his energy, from amused condescension to coiled attention. "But financial crimes are just the foundation of Mr. Walsh's enterprise," Ida said, her voice dropping lower, more intimate, as if sharing a terrible secret. "The real power came from what he did to protect that empire. Bribes to city officials, blackmail of competitors, and when bribery and blackmail failed." She clicked the remote again. Surveillance photos filled the screen. Waldo meeting with known members of the Costello crime family in the back room of an Italian restaurant in Queens. Another image showed him shaking hands with Dmitry Volkov, a Russian oligarch wanted in 3 countries for arms trafficking. The defendant cultivated relationships with some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, Ida said. He provided them with legitimate businesses to clean their money. In exchange, they provided him with protection, muscle, and access to capital that no legitimate bank would touch. She could hear Waldo's breathing now, slightly faster, though his face remained a mask of aristocratic disdain. His defense attorney, a silver-haired shark named Gerald Fisk, scribbled notes with aggressive strokes of his pen. "The evidence you're about to see," Ida continued, "represents 18 months of undercover work by federal agents, analysis of financial records obtained through court-authorized warrants, and testimony from multiple witnesses who have agreed to cooperate with this prosecution." She clicked again. Transaction records appeared, dates, amounts, routing numbers that told the story of criminal profits flowing through legitimate channels like poison in clean water. But then Ida's hand trembled slightly as she pulled up the next file. This was where the professional became personal, where the prosecutor became the wife, the woman who'd been destroyed and rebuilt herself into something harder. "However, Your Honor, there's another dimension to this case that the jury needs to understand." Ida's voice remained steady, but something in her tone shifted, became edged with barely contained pain. To maintain his criminal enterprise, the defendant needed more than just criminal connections. He needed legitimacy. respectability, access to circles of power that his background and methods would normally prohibit. She clicked the remote with more force than necessary. A photograph filled the screen. Ida herself, 3 years younger, radiant in an emerald gown, standing beside Waldo at a charity gala. His arm was around her waist, proprietary and possessive. They looked like the perfect couple. American aristocracy. "This is Senator Richard Hunt's daughter," Ida said, her voice flat now, clinical, as if discussing a stranger. Graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law. Former prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office. She came from a family with 3 generations in public service. The kind of pedigree that opens doors even in the highest circles of power. The courtroom had gone deathly quiet. Even the reporters had stopped writing. The defendant targeted her deliberately, Ida continued, and now she turned to face Waldo directly for the first time. Their eyes locked across the courtroom. He researched her background, engineered their first meeting at a fundraiser, and conducted what appeared to be a whirlwind romance. In reality, it was a calculated acquisition. Waldo's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles going white. But he didn't look away. 6 weeks after they met, he proposed. 3 months later, they were married. And immediately, doors began opening for Walsh Development Corporation. Meetings with city council members. Introductions to real estate investment trusts. Favorable zoning decisions that had previously been denied. Ida clicked through a series of documents. Permits approved 3 days after she'd attended a dinner with her father and the city planning commissioner. Favorable tax assessments issued 1 week after she'd spoken at a real estate industry conference. The defendant used his wife's name, her family's reputation, and her connections to legitimize his criminal operations, Ida said. And when she began to suspect something was wrong, when she started asking questions about late-night meetings and unexplained cash deposits, he isolated her systematically from everyone who might help her see the truth. Another click. Phone records appeared showing block numbers, deleted contacts. Testimony excerpts from her former colleagues who said they'd tried to reach her, but were told she'd asked not to be disturbed. Text messages to her father, intercepted and deleted before they were sent. Emails to former law school friends, redirected to an account the defendant controlled. He created a cage of isolation so complete that by the time she realized what was happening, she had no one left to turn to. Ida's voice cracked slightly on the last word. She steadied herself, one hand pressing against the jury box railing. But the isolation wasn't just digital, she continued, softer now. It was emotional, psychological. The defendant was careful never to leave marks that would show. Instead, he used affection as a weapon, love as a cage. She pulled up a final image, a grainy photograph taken through a hotel room window. Waldo, clearly identifiable, with a woman who wasn't his wife. The woman's face was turned away, but her hand was on his chest, intimate and familiar. This photograph was taken 14 months after the defendant's marriage, Ida said. The woman is Natasha Petrov, daughter of Viktor Petrov, who runs the largest money laundering network in the tri-state area. The defendant wasn't just having an affair. He was conducting business, using seduction as another tool in his criminal enterprise. She clicked through 3 more photographs. 3 more women, each one connected to a different criminal organization or corrupt official. The defendant conducted at least 7 extramarital affairs during his marriage, Ida said. Each woman was chosen not for passion, but for profit, for access, for the leverage she could provide. Finally, she turned back to face Waldo fully. The courtroom had faded away. For a moment, it was just the 2 of them. The man who had destroyed her and the woman who had become his destruction. The defendant thought he'd married a useful fool, Ida said quietly, but her voice carried to every corner of the room. A well-bred woman who would smile at parties, sign documents she didn't read, and never ask difficult questions. He was wrong. Waldo's eyes had changed. The amusement was gone entirely now, replaced by something complex and unsettling. He was looking at her the way a hunter might regard prey that had suddenly revealed fangs of its own. With wariness, with a new kind of respect. with something that looked disturbingly like desire. 18 months ago, Ida continued, the defendant's wife contacted the FBI. She offered to work as a confidential informant, gathering evidence from inside the marriage. Every dinner party became an intelligence operation. Every private conversation was recorded. Every document left carelessly on his desk was photographed and catalogued. She pulled up the final image, Ida herself wearing a wire, the tiny device barely visible beneath her evening gown. The timestamp showed it was taken 8 months ago at a Walsh Development Corporation gala. For 18 months, she lived in the same house with a man she'd learned to fear, Ida said. Shared his bed, pretended to love him, all while systematically documenting every crime, every meeting, every transaction that would eventually bring his empire down. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison banged her gavel for order. Ida walked slowly back to the prosecutor's table, but she kept her eyes on Waldo. His face had gone carefully blank, but his hands were still gripping the table's edge. She could see the muscle ticking in his jaw, the barely controlled tension in his shoulders. He looked like a man who'd just realized the woman he'd underestimated had been 3 steps ahead of him all along. The evidence you'll see over the course of this trial, Ida said, will prove beyond reasonable doubt that Waldo Walsh built his empire on crime, maintained it through corruption, and protected it with manipulation and emotional abuse. The prosecution is confident that when you've heard all the evidence, you'll find the defendant guilty on all counts. She sat down, arranging her files with steady hands that betrayed nothing of the storm inside her chest. Judge Morrison was speaking, something about the defense's opening statement, but Ida couldn't hear the words over the roaring in her ears. She'd done it. She'd laid out the case that would destroy him. So why did it feel like she was the one being torn apart? Across the courtroom, Waldo was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Not with fear this time, with something far more dangerous, recognition. He was finally seeing her, really seeing her, not as the convenient wife or the useful pedigree, but as the woman who'd matched him move for move, lie for lie, and come out ahead. His lips curved into the smallest, most dangerous smile she'd ever seen. And Ida realized with a jolt of electric terror that for the first time in their 3-year marriage, Waldo Walsh was genuinely interested in her. The click of Ida Hunt's heels echoed through the empty corridor like a countdown. She didn't slow down, didn't look back. The recess had been called 10 minutes ago, and she'd walked out of that courtroom with her head high and her evidence folders clutched against her chest like armor. Behind her, she'd left Waldo Walsh sitting at the defendant's table, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear, his face no longer wearing that insufferable smirk. Good. Let him sit there. Let him feel what it was like to be powerless for once. The courthouse hallway stretched before her, all marble floors and expensive wood paneling, the kind of ostentatious luxury that men like Waldo worshipped. She'd almost made it to the prosecutor's private conference room when she heard the door behind her open. Ida! His voice. Low, rough, stripped of the casual arrogance he'd worn like cologne for the past 3 years. She froze. Every instinct screamed at her to keep walking. She was winning. She had him exactly where she wanted him, cornered, exposed, facing 15 to 20 years in federal prison. There was nothing he could say that would change that. Nothing he could offer that she hadn't already considered and rejected. But her feet wouldn't move. I know you can hear me, Waldo said closer now. I know you're not going to run. She turned slowly, and the sight of him stole the breath from her lungs. He'd loosened his tie. His dark hair, normally styled with meticulous precision, was disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. The confidence that usually radiated from him like heat had cracked, and beneath it she could see something she'd never witnessed before. Fear. Not of prison. Not of losing his empire. Fear of losing her. You shouldn't be out here, she said, her voice colder than she felt. Your attorney will be looking for you. Let him look. Waldo took another step forward, and Ida's pulse kicked up despite herself. We need to talk. No, we don't. She adjusted her grip on the folders, using them as a barrier between them. Everything I have to say to you, I'm saying in that courtroom. Under oath. with a judge and jury present. Ida, it's Prosecutor Hunt in this building, Mr. Walsh. Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe. Or anger. With Waldo, it had always been hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Fine, he said quietly. Prosecutor Hunt. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. You're not in a position to ask me for anything. I know. His jaw tightened. I'm asking anyway. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Voices drifted from the main lobby, too far away to distinguish words. Ida could feel her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. This was a mistake. She should walk away. She should. Conference room 2, she heard herself say. 5 minutes. And if your lawyer tries to turn this into a plea negotiation, I walk out. No lawyers. She looked at him sharply. That's not smart. I don't care. Waldo's dark eyes held hers, and for the first time since she'd walked into that courtroom, she saw the man she'd married. Not the criminal. Not the defendant. The man who'd once looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth having. I need to talk to my wife. You don't have a wife anymore, Ida said softly. You have a prosecutor. But she walked toward conference room 2 anyway. The room was small, designed for attorney-client meetings. A narrow table for chairs, a window overlooking the city skyline. Ida set her folders down with deliberate care and remained standing, her back to the window. Waldo closed the door behind them. The click of the latch felt final. Talk, Ida said. He didn't. For a long moment, he just stood there, 3 feet away, studying her like he was trying to memorize every detail. The way her burgundy suit jacket emphasized her shoulders. The way her dark hair was pulled back in a style that was all business, nothing soft. The way she held herself like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. You look different, he finally said. I'm not different. You just never actually looked at me before. That's not true. Isn't it? Ida's voice was steady, but her hands had curled into fists at her sides. You looked at what you wanted me to be. The perfect wife. The beautiful accessory. The woman who smiled at your business partners and kept her mouth shut about where the money came from. Ida, you never once asked what I wanted. What I'd given up to marry you. She took a step forward, and Waldo instinctively moved back. Did you even know I graduated top of my class at Harvard Law? That I had offers from 3 federal prosecutors' offices before we met? His silence was answer enough. No, she continued, her voice dropping to something dangerous. Because you never asked. You saw a pretty face at a charity gala, and you decided you wanted me. So you pursued me with the same ruthless focus you used to buy real estate and launder money. And her voice cracked just slightly. I fell for it. For you. I actually believed you loved me. I did love you. You loved owning me. That's not. Waldo stopped, exhaled sharply. Maybe at first. Maybe I didn't understand the difference. But Ida, I swear. Don't. She held up a hand. Don't you dare try to rewrite history now. I was there, Waldo. I was there for every lie, every dismissal, every time you made me feel small so you could feel powerful. I was there when you told me to quit my clerkship because it didn't look good for your wife to work. I was there when you slept with your business partner's daughters to seal deals. I was there when you moved money through shell companies and laughed about how easy it was to fool everyone. Then why didn't you leave? The question came out raw. If I was so terrible, why did you stay? Because I loved you. The words exploded out of her, 3 years of suppressed rage and heartbreak pouring into the small room. Because I was stupid enough to believe that if I was patient, if I was perfect, you'd eventually see me as more than a possession. That you'd become the man I thought you were. Waldo flinched like she'd struck him. When did you stop? He asked quietly. When did you stop loving me? Ida looked away, her throat tight. Through the window, the city sprawled beneath them, glittering and indifferent. I don't know. Maybe it was the night you forgot our anniversary, because you were too busy meeting with the Catalano family. Maybe it was when I found lipstick on your collar, and you didn't even bother lying about it. Maybe it was the morning I realized I couldn't remember the last time you'd asked me how I was feeling. Ida. Or maybe, she continued, turning back to face him, I never stopped. Maybe that's the real tragedy. Maybe she stopped herself, jaw clenching. The air between them crackled. Waldo closed the distance in 2 strides, and suddenly he was right there, close enough that she could smell his cologne, could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. Her back hit the window, and she realized with a start that she'd retreated without meaning to. "Say it," he demanded, his voice low and rough. "Say what you were going to say. Get away from me. Say it, Ida." His hand came up, and she thought he was going to touch her face. Her body tensed, ready to pull away, or was it ready to lean in? She didn't know anymore. Didn't trust herself. But his hand stopped inches from her cheek, hovering in the space between them like he didn't dare bridge that final gap. "I never knew," he said, and his voice was wrecked. "I never knew what I had until I watched you walk into that courtroom. Until I saw you standing there with all that power, all that brilliance I'd tried to bury. And I realized, God, Ida, I realized I'd married a queen and treated her like a pet. It's too late for this." But her voice had lost its edge. "I know." His hand was still there, not quite touching. "I know it's too late. I know I'm going to prison. I know I destroyed everything. But I need you to know," he stopped, swallowed hard. "I need you to know that I see you now. Finally. And you're magnificent." Ida felt something crack inside her chest. This was what she'd wanted for 3 years. To be seen. To be recognized as more than decorative. To have him look at her with respect instead of possessive pride. And now that she had it, it meant nothing. Because it had come too late. "You don't love me," she said softly. "You love that you can't control me anymore. You love that I'm the one thing your money and power can't buy back. This isn't about me, Waldo. It's about your ego. That's not true. Isn't it?" She finally found the strength to push past him, putting distance between them. "If I dropped these charges right now, if I walked away from this case, would you still look at me like that? Or would you go right back to treating me like a beautiful object you owned?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. And that was the answer. Ida picked up her folders, her hands steady now. "5 minutes are up. Ida, please." "The prosecution rests," she said, and her voice was pure ice. "I'll see you back in court, Mr. Walsh." She walked to the door, her spine straight, her head high. She reached for the handle. "I'll wait for you." She froze. "However long it takes," Waldo continued, his voice rough with emotion she didn't want to believe was real. "When this is over, when I've served my time, I'll come find you. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving I can be the man you deserved from the beginning." Ida's hand tightened on the door handle. She didn't turn around. Couldn't. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't make this harder than it already is. It's not a promise. It's a fact." She pulled the door open and walked out without looking back. But as she moved down the hallway toward the courtroom, toward justice and vindication and everything she'd worked for, she could feel his eyes on her. Could feel the weight of those words settling into her bones. And the worst part, the part that terrified her more than anything, was that some traitorous piece of her heart believed him. The courtroom felt smaller now. Ida Hunt stood behind the prosecutor's table, hands resting lightly on the polished wood, her burgundy suit jacket perfectly pressed despite the 3 grueling weeks of trial. Across from her, Waldo Walsh sat with the kind of stillness that came from a man who'd finally run out of moves. His arrogance had eroded gradually over the course of the trial. Chipped away piece by piece with every exhibit she'd introduced, every witness she'd systematically destroyed on cross-examination, every sidebar where his legal team scrambled to contain the damage she inflicted with surgical precision. Now, as Judge Lorraine Pemberton reviewed her notes one final time, the courtroom held its collective breath. Ida didn't look at him. She couldn't. Not yet. She'd spent the last 18 months preparing for this moment, building an airtight case against the man she'd once loved so completely she'd abandoned her own dreams to become Mrs. Waldo Walsh. The man who'd promised her the world and delivered a beautifully decorated cage instead. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Pemberton's voice cut through the silence. "We have, Your Honor." The jury foreman, a middle-aged architect named Gerald Stevenson, stood with the verdict form trembling slightly in his hands. Ida's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained perfectly composed. This was what she'd trained for at Harvard, what she'd sacrificed everything to achieve. Justice. Pure, uncompromising justice. On the count of money laundering in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. A ripple moved through the gallery. Ida's fingers tightened imperceptibly against the table. On the count of racketeering? Guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud? Guilty. 8 counts. 8 guilty verdicts. Each one landed like a hammer blow, and with each one, Ida felt something inside her crack just a little more. She'd won. God help her, she'd actually won. Judge Pemberton's gavel struck once, sharp and final. Mr. Walsh, please rise. For the first time in hours, Ida allowed herself to look at him. Waldo stood slowly, his expensive Italian suit still immaculate, his dark hair perfectly styled. But something in his face had changed. The smugness was gone. In its place was something raw and real, something she'd never seen in all their years together. Regret. Mr. Walsh, Judge Pemberton continued, her tone measured but firm, you've been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be scheduled for 6 weeks from today, but I want to be clear. Given the severity and scope of your crimes, you're facing significant prison time. The court will hear from both parties before making a final determination. She paused. Does the defendant wish to make a statement at this time? Waldo's attorney, Preston Blackwood, a shark in a $3,000 suit, leaned in to whisper urgently. Waldo shook his head, dismissing him with a gesture. I do, Your Honor. Ida's pulse quickened. This wasn't in the script. Preston looked like he wanted to physically restrain his client. Keep it brief, Mr. Walsh. Waldo turned, and his eyes found Ida's across the courtroom. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch despite everything. Despite the betrayal, the lies, the 18 months of methodically dismantling his empire. I'm not going to insult this court or the jury by claiming innocence, he said, his voice steady. Everything the prosecution proved, I did it. Every offshore account, every shell company, every deal that crossed the line. That's on me. The courtroom was utterly silent. But there's one thing I need to say. His eyes never left Ida's. I've built an empire. I've made more money than most people can comprehend. I've outmaneuvered politicians, business rivals, and federal investigators for years. His voice dropped, became rougher. And none of it, not $1, not one victory, none of it means a damn thing compared to what I lost when I lost her. Ida felt her carefully constructed walls tremble. Your Honor, I know I'm going to prison. I accept that. I deserve that. Waldo's jaw tightened. But when I get out, and I will get out, through legal appeals and proper channels, I'm going to spend every day proving to my wife that I can be the man she deserved from the beginning. The man I was too arrogant and stupid to be when I had her. Mr. Walsh, Judge Pemberton began. I'm not asking for leniency, he interrupted, then caught himself. I apologize, Your Honor. I'm asking for time. Time to become someone worthy of her. That's all. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Pemberton studied him for a long moment, then shifted her gaze to Ida. Does the prosecution wish to respond? Every eye in the courtroom turned to her. Ida stood slowly, her mind racing. She'd prepared a victim impact statement, carefully worded to ensure maximum sentencing. But standing here now, with Waldo's words still hanging in the air, the prepared speech felt hollow. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and strong. 3 years ago, I walked into a charity gala as a Harvard Law graduate with a promising career ahead of me. I walked out as Waldo Walsh's fiancée. Within 6 months, I'd abandoned my career, distanced myself from my family, and shaped my entire existence around being his wife. She could feel Waldo's eyes on her, but she kept her focus on the judge. He didn't force me. I chose it. Because I loved him. Because I believed the man he showed me in private moments was real. Her voice hardened. I was wrong. The man I loved was a carefully constructed illusion designed to give him access to my family's political connections and provide respectable cover for his criminal activities. Ida, Waldo's voice was barely a whisper, but she heard it. She ignored him. For 18 months, I've worked to bring him to justice. Not out of revenge, Your Honor, but because the law matters. Because no one, no matter how wealthy, how powerful, how charming, is above it. She paused, letting her words settle. Justice has been served today. That's all I came here for. That's all I'll ever need from this. She sat down, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Judge Pemberton nodded slowly. Thank you, Ms. Hunt. She turned to the bailiff. Remand the defendant into custody pending sentencing. The gavel fell one final time. Ida watched as U.S. Marshals approached Waldo, producing handcuffs with practiced efficiency. Preston was already on his feet, barking instructions about appeals and bail pending sentencing review, but everyone in the room knew it was over. As the marshals secured the cuffs, Waldo turned one last time. His eyes locked with Ida's across the courtroom, and in that moment, everything else fell away. The judge, the gallery, the reporters already rushing for the exits to file their stories. It was just the two of them, and the look in his eyes was a promise. Dangerous. Unwavering. Obsessive. This isn't over. Then he was gone, led through the side door toward processing and eventually prison. Ida remained seated as the courtroom slowly emptied. Her colleagues from the prosecutor's office congratulated her, reporters shouted questions she didn't answer, and somewhere in the chaos, she heard Preston Blackwood already spinning the narrative for the cameras outside. But she couldn't move. She'd won. She'd destroyed the man who'd destroyed her first. So why did victory taste like ashes? 6 months later, Ida stood in her new corner office on the 32nd floor of the federal building, looking out over the city as twilight settled over the skyline. The promotion had come through 3 weeks after the verdict. Senior Prosecutor, White-Collar Crimes Division. Her career had not just been restored, it had skyrocketed beyond anything she'd imagined back when she was a naive law student. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Walsh Enterprises Air launches prison reform initiative from behind bars. Ida's finger hovered over the notification. She should delete it. She should block all news about him, move forward, embrace her new life. Instead, she opened it. The article detailed Waldo's work with a non-profit legal organization, using his own case as a framework for exposing corruption in the criminal justice system. There was a quote from his attorney. Mr. Walsh is committed to using his experience to create positive change. He's not the same man who walked into that courtroom. The photo accompanying the article showed Waldo in prison-issued clothing, but even that couldn't diminish the intensity in his eyes. Ida stared at the image for a long moment, then slowly closed the app. On her desk, a small velvet box sat half-hidden beneath a stack of case files. Inside was her wedding ring, the massive diamond Waldo had presented to her on a yacht in the Mediterranean, back when she still believed in fairy tales. She hadn't been able to wear it since the trial, but she hadn't been able to throw it away either. Outside her window, the city lights began to glow against the darkening sky. Beautiful. Cold. Perfect. Just like her new life. Ida turned away from the window, grabbed her briefcase, and headed for the door. She had a morning meeting with the Attorney General about a new case, a senator with ties to offshore gambling operations. But as she stepped into the elevator, her phone buzzed again. A single text from an unknown number. 3 years, Ida. That's my sentence. And when I walk out, the first place I'm going is wherever you are. Wait for me or don't. But I'm coming for you either way. The elevator doors closed, and Ida stared at the message, her heart racing for reasons she refused to examine too closely. 3 years. She slipped the phone back into her purse and pressed the button for the lobby. 3 years to build an even stronger career. 3 years to move on completely. 3 years to decide if the man who'd betrayed her could ever become the man he promised to be. Or 3 years to prepare for round 2. The elevator descended into the city night, and Ida Hunt, senior prosecutor, Harvard Law graduate, the woman who'd taken down one of the most powerful men in the city, smiled. A slow, dangerous smile that would have looked perfectly at home on Waldo Walsh's face. 3 years. Game on. If you enjoyed this story of justice, betrayal, and dangerously unfinished business. Let me know in the comments what you think Ida should do when Waldo gets out. Should she give him a second chance, or make him pay all over again? And don't forget to subscribe for more dark romance stories where power, passion, and revenge collide in the most unexpected ways.